Now it's time for another edition of What Would Jello Do? I'm still in Greece, and this is the Park of Navarine, named after the street behind me. And it's a very special park because it's another monument to what happens if people occupy, protest, squat, and stick with it. This was a parking lot. Then the plan was to make it into a shopping mall, but people seized the space, held out 24/7 for months until the authorities gave up as the trees were being planted and it was turning more and more into a real park. And the Park of Navarine was born today. It's kind of like People's Park in Berkeley, where people seized the space, and every once in a while the University of California still tries to take it back, floating a trial balloon. Wouldn't it be better to cover this with concrete and make a volleyball court, and then all these freaks come out of nowhere and defend the sanctity of People's Park? And after all these years, it must be 40 plus years now, People's Park stays. So again, Greeks kick ass at these things. But I've been thinking all along, for every action there must be an equal reaction, and it was not that long ago in 1967 when the mask came off and the authorities were implicated in some murders of dissidents that the military said, okay, fine, you know what we are? We're taking over the country. There's a military coup in the world's oldest democracy, and Greece was a dictatorship until, I believe, 1974, when some clown general decided he should try and take over all of Cyprus and kick the Turks out. They lose the war and they lose the dictatorship itself. And democracy in some form, or some in Greece would call it kleptocracy, kind of like the United States now, returns. But with all these protests and all the wild things going on against austerity, is another reaction being planned? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. Some people may know that Grecians themselves were shocked in the recent election when an avowed Nazi, not just neo-Nazi, but full-on Nazi party, calling themselves, of all things, the Golden Dawn, no, not the Texas psychedelic legends, no, not a New Age lotus flower shampoo, Nazis called the Golden Dawn, went from 0.01% of the vote to 7% of the vote, and they have seats in the parliament now, and their estimated support now is up to about 15 to 17%. But it doesn't stop there. They became known in part because a lot of them are physically buff, they're thugs, and they were starting to say, clean up the neighborhoods if the cops weren't showing up, by doing things like beating the living daylights out of immigrants and destroying their businesses and stalls until they fled. And the reports even in the mainstream media are now that half to 60% of the police in Greece are supporting or are members of the Golden Dawn, and many of the upper military brass, some of whom were young soldiers back in the military dictatorship and are now running the thing and maybe have some weird nostalgia for the 60s that's exactly the opposite of some of ours. They're down with it too, as is the underworld, as is the church, who's been supplying the Golden Dawn with food to give out in poor neighborhoods to show how charitable they are. And I hear over and over and again, one of the reasons they are gaining traction with a pro-fascist, pro-violent, very racist, anti-immigration message, very authoritarian, is like the Tea Party in the United States. They talk very plainly to people who are vulnerable and frightened about the same things we are, losing their jobs, losing their homes, not being able to put food on the table and feed their families. And you know, the so-called left will talk over their heads with the usual political platitudes and words like paradigm and pedagogy that people don't even want to hear. But then the Golden Dawn, the leader a few days ago, apparently he openly Sieg Heiled and said, at least these hands are clean. And unfortunately, that resonated. But it doesn't stop there. There have been violent clashes between anti-government activists and members of the Golden Dawn. And then I was in Crete for a few days, doing tourist thing, visiting the island, learning about the Minoans, where the goddess ran things and the women ran the place while the men went out and gathered into the fighting, things like that. Anyway, my friends in Crete at first said, well, the Golden Dawn has not really caught on here very well. We're not that worried yet. They tried to open an office and protesters stopped it. Well, yeah, here comes the spooky music louder from the other people too. Then, almost the next day, the same friend says that a friend of his was visited at work by 3 people identifying themselves as members of the Golden Dawn, saying, we've been seeing you at these protests, and if we see you at another one, we are really going to mess you up. That's really scary. And again, Greece being the petri dish of Dr. Franken-Greedenstein to see how much money they can steal out of all the other countries, how much of this may already be going on elsewhere too, and how do you fight back? There was a big discussion on my spoken word show about that. The best I could do was my same don't hate the media, become the media. Many people supporting them now have no idea what they really are. They just know they don't like what's going on. Neither the austerity nor the corruption. Clean hands, they like it. Somebody home, work, school, family starts spouting Tea Party, Golden Dawn, anti-immigration, racism, whatever. Don't dismiss them as being stupid, yell at them or whatever. Talk to them. Don't argue, communicate. If you know them well, you know what's important in their hearts, what they're worried about, and communicate them that way. For example, in America, it's just simple. It's not the Mexicans who are stealing your jobs and your money. It is Wall Street greed mongers instead, and action starts at local level, blah, blah, blah. You've heard it all from me before. But in the meantime, in Greece, it's heavier, and some people in the crowd are saying, we just need to fight these people one-on-one, fight violence with violence. And I had to say, hey, wait a minute. They have the cops on their side. They are already armed, and it's militia movement stuff too. They're already armed, and even if you start getting arms, they're going to know how to use them. You aren't. They're trained in hand-to-hand combat. You aren't. You pull a gun or even a club on them, they're going to know how to get it away from you with that old martial arts move or whatever, and possibly beat the living daylights out of you or worse with your own weapon. That's as far as I can go on what would Jello do for this, because I feel kind of vexed, and the rise of something like this in a country and people I've grown to love kind of scares the living daylights out of me, especially considering I come from a country where there's a lot more people with guns, and some of them are crazy. America may be drunk on religion compared to countries in Europe, but we don't worship any god nearly as much as we worship guns, and we don't worship guns nearly as much as we worship money. But that's the way the pyramid goes.